Right, let's start with a question. How well do you sleep at night? For the privileged, it might be a bed designed in Scandinavia, but made by sweatshop labour in China. Transported by a road haulage firm from Eastern Europe, where drivers are known to work excessive hours and receive low pay. Indeed, it is now almost possible to ship almost anything anywhere for next to nothing. The cotton in your sheets is most likely to have come from Uzbekistan, where forced labour is part and parcel of the employment relationship. The sheets would have been washed by household name detergent, probably including palm oil from Indonesia, where children as young as 8 are trapped in exploitative working conditions. Indeed, this is kind of one of the worst forms of child labour. The question therefore really is, how can we sleep at night knowing about these indecent conditions of work in global supply chains? These supply chains that cut across national boundaries now account for 80% of world trade, and as the previous illustrations show, pose a significant challenge for what the International Labour Organization calls decent work. Now, we all want decent work, whatever country we come from, but for many in global supply chains this remains a distant dream. Persistent labour rights violations in these chains can be thought of as a product of a governance gap, as the gap between the power of transnational corporations and the power of societies to manage their adverse consequences. These gaps provide a permissive environment for companies of all kinds to engage in wrongful acts without sanctioning or reparation. Ultimately, how to bridge these gaps is one of the most fundamental challenges of the 21st century. So who's responsible for bridging these gaps?
Well, traditionally we might have looked towards the nation state and other social actors within particular countries. The problem today is that these global supply chains cut right across national state territory. So everybody's connected, but nobody seems to be responsible for working conditions along the supply chain. Take the recent example of the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh, where over 1,100 workers lost their lives. We see both the ineffectiveness of international labour standards, even though some of these standards are recognised by the Bangladeshi government, but also the way in which conditions in these factories is being driven by the activities of Western multinational corporations. So somewhere along the supply chain, from the top to the bottom, it seems that the responsibility of the employers towards their workers has somehow dissipated, if not vanished into thin air.
So international labour standards define these responsibilities, and the only organisation with a mandate to adopt these and define these is the International Labour Organization, which is the focus of our recent paper published in Human Relations. So the ILO was established 100 years ago in 1919, and is unique within the UN family in having a tripartite structure which includes representatives from workers, employers, as well as governments. However, this does create some problems when trying to reach consensus. Indeed, the first Director General of the ILO, Albert Thomas, likened the organisation to a car, in which the governments acted as the steering wheel, the workers as the engine, and the employers as the brakes. So if we go back to the example of Rana Plaza, the employers have argued that the problem was building standards, not labour standards, contrary to the fact that workers were forced to re-enter the factory or lose their jobs, even though previously they had been the ones to identify the cracks in the walls. For the ILO, global supply chains present a particular problem, not least because there's 450 million workers employed in these chains. But more importantly, because the multi-level governance structure of ILO conventions, these are international labour standards ratified by member states at the horizontal level, misses the convoluted vertical nature of global supply chains that cut across these national boundaries. So in simple terms, as the current Director General of the ILO, Guy Ryder, has said, it's a nation-state-based approach to international labour behaviour. However, this pessimistic view misses the almost 3,000 international civil servants that work for the ILO that share the organisation's mission. What we demonstrate in the paper is the ILO is not stuck with this horizontal approach to international labour standards, because the International Labour Office, the 3,000 or so international civil servants that work for the ILO, have the capacity to reframe the way that international labour standards are enacted and enforced. So how does the ILO move the debate forward on global supply chains? Or in other words, how do they stop the employers from applying the brakes?
Fundamentally, the ILO needs to change the way in which we look at the world. So in the case of global supply chains, the employers might argue that these are ladders of development which will raise workers out of poverty, whereas workers might see them as the source of exploitation and inequality between nations. What we focused on in our research is how the ILO has developed new policy ideas that become part of a policy programme, and ultimately that might lead to a policy paradigm. In simple terms, what we mean by that is a very different way of thinking about how we regulate global supply chains, a shift from the horizontal to the vertical. Now, in terms of the way in which the International Labour Organization operates, what's really important is how you get these issues onto the agenda of the International Labour Conference that meets every year, where all the representatives from governments, employers, and workers come together in Geneva for what's generally referred to as the Parliament of Labour.
So when I was working for the International Labour Office in 2016, the ILO debated the issue of decent work and global supply chains at the International Labour Conference. The employers continued to apply the brakes, but found that the brake pads were severely worn thin by the discourse and the multiple examples of indecent work and global supply chains. With support from the office, the workers' group were able to get a conclusion on the need for a new international labour standard to deal with global supply chains. What might that standard look like? Well, we have a very good example from the Maritime Labour Convention.
As you can imagine, international shipping is one of the most difficult industries to regulate because of the proliferation of flags of convenience, where a company from one country will fly the flag of another country in order to avoid labour legislation. The Maritime Labour Convention is not only one of the most comprehensive ILO standards, covering 90% of world shipping, it also gives the port state the ability to enforce international labour standards over the flag state. So when a ship calls at a country's port, that country can enforce international labour standards. That's exactly what we need for global supply chains, where member states are able to enforce standards on other member states.
So what are the prospects for the future? A new standard on decent work and global supply chains will no doubt be a long time in the making, particularly as employers will continue to put their foot on the brakes. But just as the Maritime Labour Convention has been incredibly successful in improving the conditions of work for some of the most exploited workers, the idea of a new standard for global supply chains is significant. There's no doubt that governance gaps will remain, but the ILO is the only organisation with the mandate to close these existing gaps. Now, if the ILO is successful, it will speak volumes for its continuing relevancy in an age of globalisation, but more importantly, could guarantee decent work for the millions of workers engaged in global supply chains. Now, if you want to know more about the ILO and decent work in global supply chains, please go and check out our recent paper published in Human Relations.